Anybody, anywhere can listen to any pastor almost in the world of any theological stripe, any of that kind of stuff. And I just want all of us to say, do I have guides or do I have at least one spiritual parent? We'll use father, but do I have that person? And all you and I may be in some people's lives is a guide. And I'm willing to say that. But we all need the Father, the one who is all in.
Dr. Brian Jenkins.
Pastor Miles Langrock.
How you doing, man?
I'm doing good, man. Ready. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Let's go. Saddle up, Podner.
Saddle up, Podner. We are talking about the book of 1 Corinthians.
We are. 1 Corinthians, as our brothers and sisters across the pond call it.
Across the pond, across that Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
So 1 Corinthians, we're in chapter 4 now, but the reason for discussing this book and selecting this letter is we've dubbed the subtitle Church in Crisis, right? And so Paul finds the Corinthian church almost very deviated from where he left them.
Right, yeah.
And so he's writing to them, and we've discussed over the last couple weeks the occasion for his writing to them, and we're going to dive into some more stuff today. Yeah.
So what we have is really, if you look at like an outline, for example, we're using Fee's commentary, Dr. Gordon Fee's commentary on Corinthians is sort of our roadmap, which if you're someone like, if you want to get it, it's a bit of a lofty read, but I find it very readable, but whatever.
It gets a little chewy and dense.
It gets a little chewy and dense. It is an academic work, but I do find it pretty readable.
And to be fair, it is has been very helpful for preparation for all these chapters.
Yeah, so it is pretty readable, especially if you know how to use a commentary to begin with. So Fee sort of points out that these next few verses sort of the end of the entire opening section, which is really Paul making the argument, if you will, about why he's allowed to address the Corinthians in the manner in which he is about to address them. And it's essentially, I am an apostle. I'm a real apostle. In other words, I've been commissioned by Jesus himself. I have the resume of an apostle. We'll talk a little bit more about this next week as well, but I have the resume of an apostle. I have the right to speak to you, and I'm the founder and planter of this church, as we see from the book of Acts. And so he's establishing that, and he's been doing it by taking these factions, these sort of sloganized factions, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, I am of Christ, and he's saying, that is not how apostleship really works, and you've got other apostles, fake apostles essentially, that are trying to tell you that is how apostleship works, and you're completely wrong. You're judging apostles on the wrong issues, and by the way, you're not really judging anything properly, which again, we'll get to that in the next several segments as he talks about areas in which they're really off in their judgment. But that heart of, this is a letter that talks about who has the right to discern what's going on with the people of God, and how the Spirit is the thing and the being that helps us discern what's really happening. And so that's a big part of that. And that's kind of where the letter starts to go.
Right on. Well, we're kicking off today in chapter 4, verse 1, and he immediately starts defining the nature of apostleship, like what it's intended to be. Yeah,
so he's coming off of, that idea of all things are yours, whether Apollos or Paul's, like because you're part of the kingdom of God, all things are yours because you are Christ and Christ is God's. And he says, so therefore, so again, it's one of those pivot moments. So this is where, as a reader, you want to pay attention to the grammar and the flow. Don't pay a lot of attention to the chapter break, actually, because the chapter breaks are after the fact. They're not in there by Paul.
Yeah.
And so just the flow, then it goes, so this is how one should regard us, verse 1, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. So what he's saying in that point is, okay, so with that being said, this is how you should view your apostles.
Right, because they were making them be these, what we would compare to today, be like celebrity pastors.
Yeah.
Right? Like
these were charismatic superstars.
Right, exactly. And he's like, no, actually, we're to be regarded as servants.
Right. But it's interesting, he says servants of Christ. And I remember way back in Bible college, one of our professors, Dr. Charles Harris, who was an old evangelist from Arkansas, had become a professor at my Bible college back in the day. And he said something about the church and about us as servants, ministers of the church. He said, always remember, you are their servant, but they are not your master. And in some ways, Paul is saying the same thing. Yes, I serve you, but I'm a servant of Christ. You, Corinthian church, are not my master. Christ is. And the reason he's starting to build this up is because all of this stuff about, I have a right to do this, I have a right, I'm an apostle, there's a very stern rebuke coming. And actually this chapter closes with the big setup to the stern rebuke. So he's wanting them to say, I'm a servant of Christ. And he said, and I'm a steward of the mysteries of God. And so the word steward and the word servant are both they're both administrative servants. So the word that he uses for servant is one who would almost like a pantry butler or the head butler of a home, who would not only serve the family, but would also manage their things. And the same as steward, someone who was not an owner, not a possessor, but a manager. And so he says, these mysteries of God, the gospel, which is what he's saying, they're not some weird out there mystery, it's the gospel. I don't own it, but I have to faithfully steward it and share it. And so he says, so therefore, and this is pretty big in 2, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful.
Yes. Yeah, and it seems as if, as I was kind of doing the prep for this, that Paul is kind of addressing maybe some people within the Corinthian church that kind of are challenging Paul. And now Paul's getting, looked at and examined as, hey, are we still with Paul? Because Paul's weak, right?
He's boring.
He's boring. You're boring.
You're boring.
Yeah.
You're boring. You're weak. You're not impressive. You're poor.
Right.
You're bald.
Homeless.
You're
all these
homeless.
things.
Like they just say, and there seems to be a really big emphasis in the Corinthian church. This is, why should we listen to you? And he says, basically, you are discerning, judging, evaluating. And that's, I think, a big thing. I think we put a lot of negative energy on the word judge, because in our culture, to judge is to condemn. You can't judge me.
You can't judge me. Yeah, exactly.
Right. But I can evaluate. I'm invited to evaluate things all the time. Am I doing a good job? Am I not doing a good job? What am I evaluating? And Paul says that the ultimate evaluation of an apostle, of a steward, of a servant is not, are they a great speaker? Are they interesting? Do they perform miracles? He goes down all the list. He says, are they faithful? That the number one qualification in discerning a church leader is essentially, are they a faithful servant? That is the ultimate standard of church leadership. And that can open up a huge can of application for the modern church right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I know sometimes we jump into that a little bit later, but think about that. Paul himself is saying, if you want to judge what a good apostle, a good leader in the church is are they a faithful servant steward? That's it. You can talk about everything else, but if you can't get there, then you really, and so what he's saying is you're trusting in all these guys who aren't even that. Yes, they're interesting. Yes, they're wealthy. Yes, they're smart. Yes, they're charismatic. Yes, they do, all these amazing spiritual things, but they're not faithful, and you're not faithful. And he said, I am. Well, and again, it's Paul, so he gets to say that. Yeah.
And he's trying to kind of corral them back in, right? They're deviating from, Paul's the founder of this church. And so he's pointing to, I think that he's been faithful. He was faithful with the how he approached them, that he didn't come with, wise words and and wisdom, but I came to you in weakness. And so he's it sounds like he's kind of separating himself from maybe some of the detractors that are just trying to woo them over.
Essentially, I think what he's saying is we're dealing with something that just isn't. So I think one thing that you realize is that there's a segment in the church, and Fee points this out, that there's a segment in the church that just isn't ambivalent about Paul or not a fan of Paul. They're actually anti-Paul.
Right.
They would say, no, Paul, we are against you. We don't, it's not that we don't like you. It's that we're not going to listen to you. We don't think you should be telling us what to do. We're going to, as we'll see in chapter 5, we're actually going to ignore what you tell us to do.
Yeah.
So Paul has to come in, and that's what he's been doing for 4 chapters, establishing his apostolic authority to anyone who would be willing to listen, so that he can come to the moments that close out this chapter and set up the next ones. And he said, of everything you want to evaluate me by, here's what I think you should evaluate me by. Have I been faithful?
Yeah.
Have I been faithful to the mystery or to the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ? And and he says, yeah, I absolutely believe that I have. Absolutely believe that I have.
What a a difficult position Paul finds himself in, right? Because he's the founder of this church. He loved them, spent time with them, and now has to both make the claim, both make the argument for his apostolic authority, but also not so much that they think that it's based on anything but servanthood and being faithful. you
Right.
know?
Yeah. It's got to be weird for him. But the thing about Paul is he always goes back to what am I actually talking about? And Paul is, at the very least, whatever you can say, Paul's consistent. He's saying, look, I'm talking about I've been faithful to the gospel. And so Paul could argue that by disagreeing with me, you're not disagreeing with me, you're disagreeing with the gospel. Paul says, I'm going to see everything through the gospel. My entire lens is the gospel. It's that gospel. And the gospel is the sacrifice, the serving, the lowering, and the only power that we have is the power of the resurrection, which comes through serving and lowering and giving yourself away. And so for everything for Paul, it's not like just a statement of belief. It is the entire worldview. Everything gets filtered, and you can read this in all sorts of scholarship about Paul. Everything gets filtered through the resurrection. That's it. Without the resurrection, and the resurrection for Paul is that thing that both proves who Jesus was and then empowers all of us. So it's not even something any of us can really hold on to. Authority and power or anything like that's not even really something that we can demand. It's all just this gift because of the resurrection.
Verse 5 kind of got me, that was one of the points where I really need to lean on the commentary, therefore judge nothing. But then he also talks about judging things. So what's
he starts with this thing. He goes, honestly, he goes, I really don't care that I'm being judged by you or any human court. Paul's very like, I really love you and I'm concerned about you, but I just genuinely don't care what you think. And that's a confidence that to me can only come from Paul. I could never have that kind of swag. Is that Riz? Does he have? No, that's not Riz. Anyway.
Something.
So yeah, it's something. So he just come to with this ultimate confidence. He goes, look, I don't really care that you evaluate or judge me because I'm not being judged by anybody. But he says, in fact, he says, I don't even judge myself. Like I'm not even that hard on myself. But in verse 4, he says, I'm not aware of anything against me, but I'm hereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. So Paul has this mentality that says, as long as I'm faithful to what God is telling me to do and to my apostolic commission by Jesus. Because remember, one of the things that he depends on to say I'm an apostle is that Jesus sent him, that he is one sent by the sent one, Jesus. And so he says, you can't judge me. It's God judging me. And he says, therefore, in anything, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes. So what he's kind of saying is, be careful that you judge me too quickly. Because if you judge me before God judges me, you'll be on the wrong side of that fight.
And what is that? The judging him, is that the examining again? Like deciding if he's a good, that he should be someone to be listened to?
Yeah, when they're saying, let me pull this up real quick.
Yep.
When they're saying, judge me, what are they saying? They are essentially saying whether or not they should listen to him. Whether or not he is valuable and has credibility as an apostle. And so he's saying, don't judge me too quickly, because if you do, you'll judge me before God gets a chance to judge me, and you'll be left out. You'll be left in this idea that there is a judgment coming, which is, it comes in the darknesses and will disclose the purposes of the heart. So it will judge that. That's what he's saying true judgment lies. That, it's starting to get a little ambiguous, but this idea that the discernment that they should be looking for is a discernment and evaluation of his heart. And his heart, he would say, he has no doubt that his heart is completely committed to the gospel. And that's why he should be considered faithful. And it says, and there's a day coming when everyone will be judged by that standard. Now that's weird because we tend to judge people by very external standards, right? So you and I are both on staff at a good-sized church, right? So we judge people by how big is your church. We judge people by how many campuses do you have. You judge people by how many followers do you have on social media. How many views do you get? We judge ourselves sometimes by how many views we get, harshly or unharshly, right? We have all these ways of evaluating. And Paul says, whatever, you will be judged one day by the sincerity and the servanthood of your heart. Are you ready? And are all those great leaders out there ready to be judged by that standard?
Yeah.
And Paul would say, and church, now you should start judging people by that standard. Yeah.
Is it safe to say that he's, again, kind of like putting putting laying the cards on the table, that there may be these kind of detractors that may themselves have something that is that they're hiding or something like that.
I think what he is working towards that he's saying these people that you are wanting to follow, not only are you judging them by the wrong standard, but they probably and more than likely are just bad people to follow. Mm-hmm. That they are in it for a wrong reason. And by the way, he will only do it by their hearts. That their hearts are in it for the wrong reason, and that's what God will judge, which is really interesting to me because sometimes when watching, some of the more negative things in church culture, especially, my heart, when's God going to, I hope they get exposed or something's going to happen or X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And I forget to trust that God will be the one that will judge all these things, that all of these things will sort of come out, they come out in the wash, and I should leave that to God. And he says, we'll disclose the purposes of the heart. And then he says, then each will receive his praise, actually, his commendation from God. And so he'll say, let that play out. Let that play out in terms of me. But then he says, but with other people, you need to quit listening to them because that's very Paul, right?
Yeah. Is it that judging, that the Lord will judge me, is that kind of a looking to the judgment day, eschatological?
The theology term for that would be that's an eschatological reality. Mm. And for Paul, because remember, everything with Paul is steeped in the resurrection. Mm. And so that Paul has, for Paul, everything is about the resurrection of Christ, which leads to this coming reality, right? So the work of Christ in the past, the present of living in the resurrected power of the Spirit, and then this future realized kingdom. So everything with Paul is based on that. And if what I'm doing now isn't going to withstand that coming day, then I should stop doing it now. I shouldn't put off dealing with things. And he brings that up a number of times. One of his sources of holiness is because the Lord is coming. Look to the day of the Lord, all these things. So there's this sense in which there's a reality coming, and you should probably just start living in light of that reality now. And so his hope is when I get evaluated, Paul's saying, I don't want to be evaluated. I don't want you to judge me in terms of what I accomplished here. Mm-hmm. I want to be evaluated on whether or not my faithfulness will be judged correctly in the coming judgment of God.
Yeah.
That's what he's trying to make sure he gets right. And I think that is really where all of us should kind of challenge ourselves. What am I judging myself on? And that's why he says, starting with faithfulness. We have to be faithful, because if I'm not a faithful steward and servant of the mysteries of God, then nothing else is going to survive anyway. Going back to chapter 3, it's all, is it gold? Is it silver? Is it precious jewels? Or is it just wood, hay, and stubble? What am I building on? That's the judgment, continuing with that idea that he's working towards. And he says, so I don't need you to worry about judging me. I don't even judge myself. I'll let God worry about judging me on that day. I'll just make sure that I'm faithful. And again, we come back to that idea of faithfulness. It's not eloquence. It's not wisdom. He's talked about eloquence in one chapter. He talked about wisdom in another chapter. He talked about spiritual gifts in another chapter. And he says, none of those matter. What matter, have I been a faithful steward? Have I been a faithful servant of God and therefore God's people? Wow, we just really, what happened?
Yeah, I knew that was going to happen. So that concludes this first section. What do you want me to say, man?
I don't know. We'll just cut it out.
Going. I figured we'd do that.
So chapter 6, he says, so this is what he says. So in verse 6 of chapter 4, let's start right here. So in verse 6 of chapter 4, he says, I've applied all these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit. And he says this, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against the other. So he's still dealing with this slogan, these camps, right? These tribes. So he's saying, here's how you know that I believe this. This is the standard Apollos and I have held ourselves to. So when you want to compare us to all these other super apostles, just know the standard we're going off of is our faithfulness to the gospel. In fact, it says that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written. And now he has introduced something that is going to pay off multiple times in this letter, of going beyond what is written. In other words, of making the gospel and the mysteries of God about things that they just simply aren't about. And about bringing things into the gospel, trying to bring things either from the Jewish culture, bringing those in, which he stops in some point, or from paganism and trying to bring those things in and make the kingdom, make the gospel about those things. And he says, no, Apollos and I, you can almost hear him. Guys, if you paid attention to our teaching, we have never made our message beyond what is written or what has been shared with us about what the gospel is. Anyone who starts bringing other stuff in, that's the ones you should be wary of, because that's when you start pitting each other against each other, that none of you would be puffed up against one another. So he's essentially saying, why are all these? Because you're dealing with stuff that is just not. It's extra stuff. It's extra stuff. We're talking about stuff that the gospel doesn't focus on, or the gospel doesn't care about. Whether it's all of the weird, the weird sexual ethics that come up in chapter 5, whether it's about the court battles in chapter 6, whether it's about the spiritual gift stuff in chapters 12, 13, and 14, whether it's about the length of hair, whether it's about your marriage, you are doing all of this other stuff, and you're not even being faithful stewards of the simple message of Christ and Him crucified. And so Paul is saying you can't do that, and then he hammers off these questions, right? Starting in verse 7, he goes, "For who sees anything different in you?" So so you guys are talking about judging. So who is the one judging? He says discerns. It's the same thing. Who is discerning? Who's evaluating anything different in any of you? Are you guys really that different? Okay. And then he says, "What do you have that you didn't receive?" So that's a rhetorical answer, is nothing. Everything you have, someone gave to you spiritually. So he's talking about spiritually. So number one, who is seeing you guys as great other than yourselves? Okay. Secondly, so let's say someone does see you as great. What do you have that you didn't receive? Right? I always think of that line between Iron Man and Captain America, right? The only thing special about you came out of a bottle. And it's that exact same mentality. Paul's saying, what is so special about you?
Yeah, and that bottle for us here is the gospel message of Jesus.
Yeah, right.
Like
you're for him, it was
it.
a super soldier serum. I hope you didn't think I was getting them confused.
No, I didn't think you thought Paul was Tony Stark for a second.
Okay, no, although... Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
That's a weird rabbit trail.
Maybe we'll unpack that in the did we miss anything? Yeah.
So, but yeah, you're right. He's asking that question. What do you have that you didn't receive? And what we're talking about is the message from Paul, from Apollos about Jesus, Him and Him crucified. Right.
And so they're saying, no, we have all this other stuff. We have this enlightened
secret
morality.
knowledge,
We have these secret mysteries. We have this prayer language that makes us sound like we're talking angels. We're so elevated about your moral constrictions and your food constrictions. We have all this other stuff.
We're above it all.
We are above it all.
Yeah.
It's like Fee says, they've arrived, but they arrived at the wrong place. You've arrived. You just showed up at the wrrong place. And that's kind of what Paul is saying. Yeah, you've arrived. You arrived at the wrong place, man.
Yeah, and back to that verse previously, where he says, do not go beyond what is written.
Yeah.
Right? I'm borrowing from another epistle right now, but in Galatians, who has bewitched you?
Who has bewitched
cursed be anyone who adds to this gospel.
Yeah, who brings you another gospel other than the one that you've received.
Right.
Why are you doing this? And by the way, that's a huge theme. That's a good way of pointing out that this is an ongoing theme in Paul.
Yeah.
The idea that there's anything other than Christ and Him crucified, because that's the world he's dealing with. He's dealing with the same world we are, which is there are all sorts of different worldviews that would be okay with Jesus, but that would still try to imply that Jesus, Him and Him crucified is not enough. That just the simple message of the cross and His grace is not enough. Whether it's, okay, therefore you will be rich, or you will be healthy, or therefore you will be enlightened, or therefore you will be mystically powerful, or therefore you will. No, Paul is saying that's the other stuff. What I'm telling you is you got to get this thing right. That's what he talks about when he talks about bread and milk and all that. I wish I could. Yeah. I would love to talk to you about that other stuff, but you're still not faithful, simple stewards of Him and crucified. So you're trying to go beyond what is written. He said that's why when Apollos and I came, neither one of us tried. You're trying to divide, and he got into that previously. You're trying to divide us when we're not even divided. We came, Christ and Him crucified. Who sees anything different in you? And then he says, what do you have that, number one, okay, so does anyone really see anything that impressive in you? Oh, well, we have spiritual gifts. Okay, so what do you have that someone else didn't give you? So if you received it, why do you boast as though you did not receive it? So he's saying, what you have, follow the logic here. Are you really that different? Yes, we are. Okay, what do you have that's different? Oh, well, we have these mysteries. Who gave it to you? Paul is actually saying, I gave it to you. I'm the one who brought the gospel mysteries to you. Why do you boast as though I'm the one who gave it to you? Why are you boasting as though this just showed up on your doorstep or you earned it? And we do that. Miles, we do that. We talk like all of this stuff just, man, I'm so glad I thought that up.
Right.
Or I'm so glad I get it and you don't. I mean, I've probably said stuff like that. Not to you, but,
Yeah.
I don't know. It just...
Yeah, no, like the standing on the shoulders of giants and not being aware where you are.
Right.
Like, exactly. They take they take where they are and who they are, who they become for granted, because they wouldn't have this gospel message unless it was brought to them. And so they think that therefore, because they have this, and then the extra stuff that they've been adding to it, that therefore it makes them elevated. And they're like, so therefore we can dispense with Paul.
Yeah, we don't need Paul anymore.
No, he was good for a little bit. But
yeah, he kind of got us started.
Babies.
Yeah, we're so far advanced. We don't need Paul. And Paul's saying, I'm the one who brought this for you in the first place. And he says, and by the way, he says this earlier, I think it's in chapter 2, right? Who really were you? Not many of you were wise. Not many of you were impressive. None of you were righteous. So who were you before you got this? You're only here now because someone gave it to you. So why are you bragging and boasting and putting all of your trust in something that's beyond what we even gave you?
Yeah. Well, Fee also says in here that he's kind of paraphrasing a couple of things. He says right behavior flows out of correct theology.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, okay, so why does this matter?
Yeah.
And I think it's very evident that it matters because our behavior flows from these thoughts, these ideas, and so we'll come to find out that because of the way that they thought, they started treating each other in very poor ways.
Yeah, so they have this allegedly elevated, secret, mysterious, hidden Christian knowledge that was elevated and higher and more enlightened than anybody else, and they treated each other worse than how pagans treat each other.
Yeah,
they went exactly the opposite direction. So Paul is saying, well, what does it matter? Why does it matter? It's simply because if you deviate or you try to master a gospel other than Christ and Him crucified, you will find yourself in a place that will ultimately depend on yourself, will look to yourself for wisdom, and you'll just get addicted and you'll get trapped in that, and you go farther and farther and farther. And the farther you get away from the simplicity of the cross, from the simplicity of the gospel, you get into the weird stuff. And he's going to have to deal with 2 in the next couple of chapters. And they could say, well, what are you talking about? And he's about to give them 2 major examples.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned, subscribe, make sure you do all that. But he's going to say, look, you honestly don't think this? Let's look at these 2 things. You behave worse than the pagans. So obviously, whatever theology you're adding or you think you've arrived at is not working ethically. And so Paul is tying that tie together. So
yeah, and evoking kind of like, well, God's going to judge my work, and He's going to judge all this as well.
Right. And so he says, so what he does is he gets into this little joke thing in verse 8. He says, well, already you have everything you want. Obviously you've arrived. So Paul, I don't believe that sarcasm is a spiritual gift, and I actually don't believe it should be used in sharing faith with people. Paul seems to be okay with it. But I'm not Paul, so I can't do it in a holy, righteous way. So it's very sarcastically, he says, well, already you have all you want. Which you talked about the eschatological realizations. He's basically saying there's nothing left for you in the future.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Like you have everything you want. Already you've become rich. And he says, wow, without us, by ignoring me, he says, you've become kings. And that would you reign? Maybe if you were to reign, you know what, guys, you should be in charge and I'll serve you. And it's insane. Paul is in fact making fun of them. And he says, I would that you reign so that we might share the rule with you, he says. For I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all. He says this, like men sentenced to death. Now, he has this huge rhetoric. Maybe he's even laughing. And he says, look, you've arrived. Like kings you've arrived. Apollos and I, we arrived like men being taken into the arena. Like men who are being made a spectacle in the arena for the sport of the world. Our martyrdom, our persecution, our poverty, our brokenness, it's on display to the world. But you guys, way to go, fellas. You've arrived.
Yep.
Way to go.
Yeah, Fee also reflects on this as well in the commentaries, that this is really difficult for the Western church to hear,
Right.
Because we want to have all these things.
We want to
wealth
sit in
and
the king's
success.
box.
Yeah.
We want to sit in the emperor's box. We want to be the ones in charge. We want to be the one who are ruling and reigning. We think that's the win. We think that's the end goal. I mean, there are whole theological structures out there that we've talked a little bit about. Whole theological structures that say, no, we actually win. We are meant to rule and reign. And Paul says, actually, the truest apostles are sentenced to death. We're paraded like the people in the arena, which that type of Christian persecution hadn't come yet. A lot of people think it's going on at this time, but just historically, it's not. That's a few centuries away. You know,
throwing into the Colosseum.
The Colosseum and the lions. That's a few centuries away. But there were still public games where sentenced criminals were sent in to die for the entertainment of the world. And he says, that's where we're at. And then he just rips him. He says, you know what? We're just fools for Christ. You guys are the wise ones.
Yeah, this is hard for them to hear because they equate that sort of stuff with this.
Right. What he's doing. What he's doing is he's saying, okay, let's look. I'm a fool for Christ. You're wise. That's what you want. You want to be wise. We're weak. You're strong. You're held in honor, we're in disrepute. So he's essentially saying your values are being wise, being strong, and being held in honor. But he said the apostles that are bringing this message to you are weak. We're cast down as being weak. You're telling us we're foolish, and you're telling us that we are disreputable. So the people that brought you the message that you're building on, you wouldn't even believe in. Now that's critical. Because Paul is absolutely convinced that he's following Jesus. So he's low-key setting up, you wouldn't even follow Jesus. The things that you honor, the things that matter the most to you, they don't play out in Jesus. You are so off track, which I will prove, Paul says, in my next couple of points about your sexual ethics in your community and about this lawsuit going on. You've so proven that you care more about these things than others. I don't even know what you listen. Like the gospel is foolishness, it's weakness, it's folly, it's a stumbling block. And that's the path I'm walking on. He said, to the present hour, we hunger and thirst. I don't have a lot of money. We are poorly dressed. We're beaten. We're buffeted and homeless. We labor working with our own hands. He said, that's your leaders. That's the life that God's called me to. Could you just imagine? I can't even imagine trying to have someone come up and say, hey, this year's conference speaker is this homeless, abused, hungry, poor, thirsty man, and he's here to speak at, Unleashed Prosperity 2024. Like, what would Paul's talking head picture look like? His little conference speaker box head, He's all sad and depressed and got bruises on his eyes.
So he has a headshot.
Yeah, if he were. Yeah. If he were. I mean, honestly, Miles, think about the churches. And to be fair, we don't obviously demonize all that as well. The looking nice and no.
I know you're not saying
funny.
that.
No, it's funny because when on one of our shorts about pride, somebody called me out for having a nice haircut. I'm like, okay, but
say thanks. Yeah,
thank you. I appreciate that you noticed the drip. Thank you.
But no, people will go to both extremes, right? So therefore, anything if you're in a position of status or you have nice things or you're put together, therefore you're doing wrong as well. It's on either side of the pendulum.
That's not what Paul's saying. And neither, by the way, is Paul saying that if your life's a total wreck and you're a disaster, boy, you're someone worth listening to. That's not what Paul's life is saying either.
He's addressing their...
Right. He's saying, I am these things because of the gospel. Because I was faithful to the gospel, this is where I've been led. And because you are unfaithful to the gospel or you've added to it, that's where you've been led. So your unfaithfulness, your lack has taken you there. And he says, but here's the difference. And this is what he starts with in the second half of verse 12 going on to 13. He says, but when reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we're the ones who endure. And when slandered, we entreat. We actually beg you to come join us.
Yeah.
He's saying when you're reviled, you freak out. When you're persecuted, you break. When you're slandered, you fight back. He's saying you have everything And yet you fight like you have nothing. I have nothing, and I can live as though I have everything.
Are we sure this isn't First Americans?
Oh my gosh. That's
not...
why, but again, that's why we pick this.
Yeah.
Because
church
it is
in crisis.
It is a church, and this is us in so many ways. We have become, and this is what I love what he says in 13, we have become and are still like the scum of the world and the refuse of all things. That's the mission statement for Unleashed Prosperity 2024.
Well,
the Theo Threads conference. Here we go. Scum of the world.
Refuse. Yeah. Again, he uses that language a lot. Like I consider all things, all these things, his laundry list of his own accolades and own accomplishments. He says, I consider all refuse for the sake of knowing Christ.
It's just a bunch of garbage. That's what he says.
Yeah.
And he's saying the scum of the world is like the dirt off the floor, and the refuse of all things is when you wash the dirt off your body. He's saying we're not the pure thing. He said that's what we are to you. That's what we are to you.
This sludge.
Just this grossness. And he said if you were to look, and it's just, I think it's compelling, and I think it's, if you're watching or you're driving the car and you're listening, goes, what is the point of all of this? It's just very, I think, to really try to ground it again, it's saying, how am I evaluating the quote unquote success of my Christian life? And how am I evaluating what type of people I listen to? And Paul is saying, are you evaluating it? The standard by which you should evaluate everything is, am I living faithful to the gospel? And if you don't know what that means in your situation, that's what discipleship is. Learning, pressing, taking your life and saying, how does my life, the way that I live with my job, my kids, my family, my church, how does that look like in faithfulness to the gospel? It may not look like mine or yours, but it looks like ours. It looks like theirs.
Yeah, so for today, are we being won over by something outside of Christ and Him crucified?
I think that we always are. Okay, so a lot of times people will say, "Oh, this is I think this this is a new thing." Or in the last few years, it seems this is proof positive that temptation is always there at the edge of the church. From day one, Paul was having to fight against going beyond, and I like that phrase. Let's keep using that. Going beyond what is written. So maybe then it may have been maybe philosophy or these mystery philosophies or these secret incantations or this enlightened thinking will be the thing that takes us farther. Now it could be maybe politics will be the thing that takes us farther. Maybe now it would be financial power. Maybe now it would be, corporate leadership wisdom that will actually take the gospel farther. Maybe it'll be communications and media savvy that will take the community. That is what is beyond what is written now. And all Paul is saying is he's saying, should we? I don't even think Paul would say use or don't use those things. He would say whatever, all of that. But do you believe it's the gospel that will take you there? That the gospel is what's going forward. Because if you're evaluating on whether or not you have all these other things, political power, media power, financial power, cultural influence, whatever, if you think that's it, but you haven't stopped and asked yourself, and if I have all that, have I been faithful to the gospel?
Yeah.
And Paul's interesting because he says, I've been faithful to the gospel, and look at me. I don't have the things that you value, but I have the thing that matters, which is faithfulness to Christ and Him crucified. And then he says this, he goes, now in verse 14, I don't write these things to make you feel ashamed.
Which is evidence that was the tone the entire time. He's saying, I'm not shaming you, but to warn you as what?
As my beloved children.
My dear children.
Yeah.
He's a pastor through and through. He loves these guys. He loves them, bro.
He loves them. They're his kids. Hey, you little whippersnapper. Come here, champ. You little knucklehead.
And a good father will not only give his children gifts and love and all those things, but he also chide them, rebuke them for being completely off base.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because it's this ongoing rhetoric all the way since chapter 1, verse 10. This is a single line of thought for 3 or 4 chapters. And then he says, now I just, everything I've just said, I love you guys. I love you,
Yeah.
I love you guys because you're like my kids, but you're knuckleheads. You're my kids and you're out of control. And this is what he says. He goes, you have countless guardians, guides in Christ. He says, you have all sorts of people trying to tell you where to go and what to do. And then he says, but you don't have a lot of fathers.
Ooh.
And I don't know why. That line's so powerful.
Yeah,
and I have to wonder why for me. He goes, and I think Paul is saying, he goes, I get it. You have all these people telling you where to go and what to do and who to believe. And he goes, but you don't have a lot of fathers. like who are laying their life down. I became your father in Christ Jesus, by the way, through the gospel. Because of the gospel, I'm your father. I'm not one of those passing voices. Right. I'm not one of those people trying to use you to get their influence, to make them. I'm not trying to use you. I'm not trying to build clout off of you. I'm not trying to push you around. I'm not a guardian or a guide. The word can go either. Which basically, that word in Greek is literally the office of someone. It was a person who would walk, like if you were wealthy, if your family was wealthy and you'd be taken to your tutor, you'd be taken to your teacher or your school, it's the person that would walk with you. He says, you've got all kinds of stuff like that. I'm not someone who's just sending you off to walk with somebody else. I'm your father. Yeah. I'm walking with you. I'm not hiring anyone else to walk you to school. I mean, think about that. Yeah. I'll take you to the bus. I'm taking you to school. I'll be your teacher if you'll let me. And he says, that's what I am.
Yeah, he founded that church among with the people who were with him. So he's not many fathers being like the founders, the ones that are primarily there and that love them, and there's this relationship. And then he's elsewhere and he gets this letter sent to him that all these things are going on. He's like, man, I have to reach back out to them, correct them, rebuke them, establish my authority as both an apostle and as your dad.
Yeah.
Like, you guys are off base and you're knuckleheads and all those things. But I love you and I care for you. And so hopefully this letter and its contents are going to convince you of that.
Yeah. And they'd already ignored one letter, which we'll see that come out in chapter 5. He'd written them once and they ignored it. And so he's getting ready to say, I'm not coming as like an advisor. I'm not writing as like, hey, here's a piece of advice. I'm not writing as a consultant. This is a parental letter. And I just purely practical. In the age of, and I know the absolute irony that I'm going to say, because some people may even see this on a short later, okay? But in the age of digital discipleship and in the age of anybody anywhere can listen to any pastor almost in the world of any theological stripe, any that kind of stuff. And I just want all of us to say, do I have guides or do I have at least one spiritual parent? We'll use father, but do I have that person? Because I think this is the same way in the digital world. You have thousands, maybe millions of guides now. You can very easily, if you're watching this as a short, you swipe it up, and the next guy's right there, maybe saying something exactly the opposite. And all you and I may be in some people's lives is a guide. And I'm willing to say that. But we all need the Father, the one who is all in, who is invested, who is in our lives, and we need that person too. It's okay to have the guides, but we need the fathers or mothers. I'm not speaking gender exclusive there, but we need those people that we are just absolutely tied to like that. Yeah,
I've spoken to many people that are, and it's usually young people, but like people say, hey, well, I'm thinking about going somewhere else, or when they're talking about church and being at church. It's like, well, I don't know about being here, and these are at various churches, but like I get more out of the things I hear online.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or I get more out of this, or da-da-da. And like you're saying, guides, like sure, there's probably good stuff. There's probably not so great stuff that's out there. But you need someone who's personally there.
Yeah.
And to overlook that, to be like, sure, that their messages aren't that great.
And that's what we say. Oh, the Father, man, I have to go listen to Pastor X. I have to go listen to, and sure, we'll use names, right? Like I have to go listen to Stephen Furtick. I have to go listen to Annie Stanley. I have to go listen to Tim Keller. I have to go listen to Mike Todd. I have to go listen to someone interesting, and they're so interesting or they're so entertaining. My pastor is so boring. Yes, but is he faithful?
Yeah.
Is she faithful? Is he or she giving their lives for you in your community? Are they in your community, by the way?
Right.
Because you know what? You may be watching this on the other side of the country, and if you get sick, I'm sorry, I'm not going to show up at the hospital. And you may find me or Miles or anyone more, quote unquote, entertaining than your pastor, or more deep, or I don't even know what that means, but more whatever. But we should be celebrating, Miles, we should be celebrating pastors that are faithful.
Yeah.
That give their lives to cities over decades. I think of my wife's grandfather, Yakima, Washington, 34 years.
Yeah.
That's faithfulness. I think of, my parents live in rural southern Arkansas. I think of those guys, faithful. No one will ever know their name. But I think of that list at the end of Hebrews 11, and he says a bunch of things that happened and never says anybody's names. And then he says, and the world was not worthy of them. That's the list I hope to be on.
Yeah. Yeah, they may not acquire a YouTube subscriber count that, is something. They may not ever be found or anything like that, but they're day in, day out being faithful to the gospel message, and the access that those individuals give to others as servants without receiving anything in return for that is not to be taken for granted.
No.
It shouldn't be. I mean, and
it shouldn't be worshipped, but it should be honored. It should absolutely be honored, because I obviously, Tim Keller fan, N.T. Wright, Craig Keener, like I have all my lists, but the late Gary McGee was in some way someone who shaped me. Now, a lot of people may not have heard of Gary McGee, right? You've heard of N.T. Wright, you've heard of Tim Keller, but Gary McGee was the one that made a difference in my life. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure you've heard of, Mark Batterson, or you've heard of, Rick Warren. You've heard of all these other pastors. Tommy Carpenter, whose name you probably haven't heard. He was one who made a difference in my life, right? Maurice Lednicki made a difference in my life. I can think of Tim Mackey, great Bible teacher. Absolutely amazing, right? Great. Fred Dickinson, the guy who helped me in junior Bible quiz, he made the difference in my life. Frank Forbes, my 6th grade Sunday school teacher, he made the difference in my life. People you've never heard of are the ones who made the difference in my life, not guides. These men were fathers. My own dad, I don't want to leave, Dad, I don't want to leave you out. But, you think about that.
Yeah.
And I've had other men in my life give me advice, but they're still not my dad. And we can't just sit there and dismiss, in my opinion, the faithfulness of people to the gospel. And I think we need to crave and return that. And by the way, if you're watching this and you're like, oh, pretty good for a guy with his own YouTube channel. Yes, I'm fully aware of my own irony and hypocrisy right now. So, but I'm judging myself, so you're fine.
Yeah, so Paul's making this appeal to his audience.
Yeah.
And he's saying, I'm your father. And therefore I urge you to imitate me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all that he set up all the things that they are in contrast to how he is and Apollos is. And he says, you can dispense with all that. Because I follow Christ, and so.
And I like that he says that, because he tied it in as a father. He's like, just all children imitate their fathers.
Yeah.
All children imitate their fathers. Every day, I find myself acting more like my father, right? And it's not and that, by the way, I'm not sad about that. I'm happy. Like my dad's a great guy.
Yeah, same.
I think of all the little things that I've picked up from my dad over the years. And he's saying, that's how, you're not imitating me because Paul is saying, I'm imitating Christ. So you're not even imitating me, you're imitating Christ. I've chosen to faithfully imitate Christ. So, and I'm your father, so just follow in my footsteps, kids. It's like when you have 4 kids, I have 3, and when they're little, it's always cute when they put on dad's shoes or mom's shoes, right? It's cute. Why? Because they want to be like mom and dad. And that's what he's saying. Follow in my footsteps. Follow in my footsteps.
Then he goes right back to.
Oh boy!
Then he goes right back to.
You talk about a tonal change.
Yeah, he gives him the whole "come on, champ," and
he's like, so he gives him what I call the fellas. Yeah. So there are times, I have a fairly deep voice, and I have kind of a stern face. I was getting my hair cut the other day, and I was just staring at the mirror, and I'm like, wow, I have the angriest face. I have one eyebrow that naturally anyway. So he goes from this, hey champ, hey bud. And then there's this thing that from time to time I'll have to drop if I see people, being a little rowdy, especially young men, and I'll drop a fellas. Yeah. And it just really, yeah. So he drops some, he's bringing dad energy at this point. And he says, by the way,
dad energy,
some are arrogant as though I were not coming to you.
Yeah, Fee says that may have been sort of the detractors. Again, why would he bring up being a dad? and the personal connection he has with them. But the detractors would say things like, well, Paul's doesn't really
not
care.
here.
He's not coming back. He keeps saying he is.
Yeah.
He wrote a letter.
All he did was send a letter. What's a letter? If he cared, he'd show up.
But now Paul's like, well, I'm sending Timothy, my beloved child.
Yeah, that's why.
Right? And then also, I hope this letter does the trick, but I'm also should I speak softly and gently to you in this nice tone, or should I come and
So he says, I will come to you soon if the Lord wills, and I will find out not the talk of these arrogant people, but their power. Yeah. He says, here's what's going to happen. I sent Timothy to tell you what was up, and now I got the first letter. I got the first response. I sent you a letter. Then I sent Timothy. Now I've heard back again. Now I'm sending this letter. And now we've gone to wait till your father comes home. We've switched. We are way over to wait till your father comes home.
Yeah.
Because he's saying some of the people, the really dangerous people in the church. And I think it's interesting because he's starting to separate the fact that the whole church is being corrupted by a handful of people.
Yeah.
I think if you pay attention to the subtext, that's going on. And his concern is the whole church is being really corrupted. And he'll talk about that in chapter 5 with leaven and unleavened stuff. He says it's all been corrupted by a handful, because it doesn't take a lot, is one of the points he makes. You're all being corrupted. He says, and some of you are acting like I'm never going to show up. And he's really saying, but when I do, we'll find out if it's talk or if it's power.
Yeah.
And then he lays verse 20, 4:20, 1 Corinthians 4:20, for the kingdom of God does not consist in talk, but in power.
Yeah.
That's a flex line.
Yeah, it's
to
pretty
me.
good. It's a pretty good, it's a mic drop moment. And
it is.
That harkens back to the first chapter.
Absolutely. He's full circle. He's a master of rhetoric.
Yeah, I didn't come to you in wisdom.
With words of wisdom.
And words of wisdom. And
but in
all
a demonstration of the Spirit and power.
Of power, yes.
Yeah. And so he says, and he comes again, he goes, I will come and I will deal with these people if I have to. And we'll see, because they're convincing you they're right based on really their bravado and their arrogance and their dismissal of me. Where does that bravado and arrogance and dismissal of me come if I actually show up in person? And we actually start to display the power of God at work in people's lives. What happens to it then? He says, because the kingdom of God is not in all the extra stuff. It's in the power of lives being changed. It's in the power of the gospel. It's in the power of the resurrection. And when he says talk, he doesn't mean like smack talk.
Right.
He means the rhetoric and the charismatic effects of the day. The extra stuff, the bells and whistles would be another way we call it. Yeah. Or as my buddy in Bible college used to call it, the dog and pony show. That's not the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God's in the gospel.
Yeah.
And then he says, so what do you want?
Yeah.
You want me to come with a rod? Or in a spirit of gentleness? Because back then they still spanked kids. But we're not going to get into that.
Not this episode.
No.
Yeah. Paul's motive for doing any of this is because he's a servant, right? He has these folks that are stirring up the church that he founded, and they're even talking smack. It sounds like they're talking smack about Paul.
Yeah.
And Paul's he's not clapping back at them to defend himself.
No, right? No.
His motivation is the people.
Yeah, the health of the church.
Yes, exactly.
Because remember, go back to 1 Corinthians, I think it's 3, right? Where he says, don't you realize you are the temple of the Holy Spirit?
Right,
and if anyone tries to destroy God's temple, they will be judged.
Yeah, again, he's just kind of, he's laying it out there. He's saying this is going to, the people who are doing this, they're going to face some consequences.
There's going to be consequences and repercussions. It's a movie. I don't know.
So yeah, Paul is... and then in the next chapter, we'll talk about a little bit of what's
I would
gonna
encourage
happen.
you to subscribe and hang in there with us and keep watching, because it's about to get weird. It's gonna get a little weird, because Paul is basically knows that they are anticipating. He said, "Oh, well, no, we're listening to you." So he's about to bring up 2 examples. One is okay. The other one's like, "Whoa, what?" And the next episode is the "Whoa, what?" So,
alrighty, well. I think we're good for today.
I think that's quite enough. Yeah.
We'll have to. It's a cliffhanger moment. We'll see next week. What is he talking about? Or you can just read the Bible and read ahead.
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
There's that.
It's the next chapter.
Well, thanks.
Is it spoiler alert after 2,000 years? What's the What's the title? Hey, Jesus
Yeah,
comes back from the dead.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, bro, what?
Yeah, that one. That's good. Well, I'm going to try to close this thing right now.
All right, hit it.
Thanks for joining us. Please take a second to like and to subscribe for notifications. Follow us on social media and share this conversation with a friend. And leave a 5-star review on your podcast app so others can find us. It'll feed that algorithmic bear.
Feed that bear.
All that good stuff. All right. Dr. Brian Jenkins.
Pastor Miles Langrock. Till next time. Actually, next week we'll have one of our podcast friends with us on the next episode.
So I get kicked out of the controversial one?
Oh, no. You'll be back.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
All
Thanks.
right, good.